Human trafficking is the act of recruiting, transporting, transferring, harboring, or receiving individuals through force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of exploitation. This exploitation may include forced labor, sexual slavery, or other forms of commercial sexual exploitation. It is considered a serious violation of human rights and a form of modern slavery. Efforts to combat human trafficking involve international laws, national policies, and non-governmental organizations. Human trafficking can occur both within a single country or across national borders. It is distinct from people smuggling, which involves the consent of the individual being smuggled and typically ends upon arrival at the destination. In contrast, human trafficking involves exploitation and a lack of consent, often through force, fraud, or coercion. Human trafficking is widely condemned as a violation of human rights by international agreements such as the United Nations Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons. Despite this condemnation, legal protections and enforcement vary significantly across countries. Globally, millions of individuals, including women, men, and children, are estimated to be victims of human trafficking, enduring forced labor, sexual exploitation, and other forms of abuse. The UN Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, which has 117 signatories and 173 parties, defines human trafficking as a. The recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring or receipt of persons, by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person, for the purpose of exploitation. Exploitation shall include, at a minimum, the exploitation or the prostitution of others or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor or services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the removal, manipulation or implantation of organs. b. The consent of a victim of trafficking in persons to the intended exploitation set forth in subparagraph a. of this article shall be irrelevant where any of the means set forth in subparagraph a. have been used. c. The recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring or receipt of a child for the purpose of exploitation shall be considered trafficking in persons even if this does not involve any of the means set forth in subparagraph a. of this article. d. Child shall mean any person under 18 years of age. According to the Global Estimates, 2021, an estimated amount of 50 million people are living in modern-day slavery across the globe. Women and children continue to make up the majority of victims worldwide. Child victims are increasingly detected globally. The United Nations Global Report on Trafficking in Persons, 2024, estimates around 38% of trafficking victims to be boys and girls. In 2024, the U.S. Department of State estimates that 2 million children are exploited by the global commercial sex trade. In the same year, a study classified 14 million individuals worldwide as forced laborers, bonded laborers, or sex trafficking victims. Approximately 2 million of these individuals are children working as commercial sex slaves, with women and girls comprising 98% of that 2 million. According to the International Labour Organization, ILO, forced labor alone, one component of human trafficking, generates an estimated $150 billion in profits per annum as of 2014. In 2012, the ILO estimated that 21 million victims are trapped in modern-day slavery. Of these, 14.2 million, 68%, were exploited for labor, 4.5 million, 22%, were sexually exploited, and 2.2 million, 10%, were exploited in state-imposed forced labor. The following is the breakdown of profits by sector: $99 billion from commercial sexual exploitation, $34 billion in construction, manufacturing, mining, and utilities, $9 billion in agriculture, including forestry and fishing, $8 billion is saved annually by private households that employ domestic workers under conditions of forced labor. Although only 19% of victims are trafficked for sexual exploitation, it makes up 66% of the global earnings of human trafficking. The average annual profits generated by each woman in forced sexual servitude, $100,000, is estimated to be 6 times more than the average profits generated by each trafficking victim worldwide, $21,800. Human trafficking is the third largest crime industry in the world, behind drug dealing and arms trafficking, and is the fastest growing activity of transnational criminal organizations. In January 2024, ANOC published the new edition of the Global Report on Trafficking in Persons. The report reveals that 38% of all victims of human trafficking detected globally between 2020 and 2023 were children, with girls accounting for 22% and boys for 16% of all detected victims. This marks a 31% increase in child detections since 2019, with a sharper 38% increase among girls. The report documented victims of at least 162 different nationalities, detected in 128 countries, with 31% of all cross-border flows involving African victims, making Africa the region with the most internationally trafficked victims. Around half of all trafficking took place within the same region, with 42% occurring within national borders. One exception is the Middle East, where most detected victims are East and South Asians. Trafficking victims from East Asia have been detected in more than 64 countries, making them the most geographically dispersed group around the world. There are significant regional differences in the detected forms of exploitation. Countries in Africa and in Asia generally intercept more cases of trafficking for forced labor, while sexual exploitation is somewhat more frequently found in Europe and in the Americas. Around 74% of traffickers operated within organized crime groups, especially in business and governance-type structures, while 42% of trafficking occurred for forced labor, which has now surpassed sexual exploitation, 36%, as the most common form. Notably, trafficking for organ removal was detected in at least 1% of cases, detected in 16 countries around the world. While significant progress has been made in legislation, with most countries having trafficking laws aligned with the UN protocol, the report continues to raise concern about criminal justice outcomes. Only 17% of global convictions in 2022 were for forced labor, despite its rise, and men made up 70% of convicted traffickers, with women comprising 28%. Overview. According to the 2018 through 2024 editions of the annual Trafficking in Persons reports issued by the United States Department of State, Belarus, Iran, Russia, and Turkmenistan continue to remain among the worst countries when it comes to protecting against human trafficking and forced labor. These nations remain on Tier 3, the lowest ranking, due to inadequate efforts to meet minimum standards for eliminating trafficking. In 2024, the National Human Trafficking Hotline received approximately 2,000 reports of potential human trafficking cases in the U.S. Estimates suggest that about 24,000 individuals were victims of trafficking nationwide, with approximately 75% being women and 40% minors. Singapore remains a destination for human trafficking, particularly involving women and girls from countries such as India, Thailand, the Philippines, and China. In 2024, reports indicated that victims are often lured under false pretenses and coerced into sex work in venues like KTV lounges, massage parlors, and even makeshift forest brothels. In November 2019, 2 Indian nationals were convicted for exploiting migrant women, making it the first conviction in the state. In the 21st century, trafficking in persons continues to thrive, particularly where armed conflicts, economic recession, health emergencies, food insecurity, climate change-induced disasters, and other humanitarian crises exacerbate existing underlying vulnerabilities. Types of trafficking. Trafficking arrangements are sometimes structured as a work contract, but with no or low payment, or on terms which are highly exploitative. They may also be structured as debt bondage, with the victim not being permitted or able to pay off the debt. It may encompass providing a spouse in the context of forced marriage or the extraction of organs or tissues, including for surrogacy and over-removal. Trafficking of children. Trafficking of children involves the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of children for the purpose of exploitation. Commercial sexual exploitation of children can take many forms, including forcing a child into prostitution or other forms of sexual activity or child pornography. Child exploitation may also involve forced labor or services, slavery, or practices similar to slavery, servitude, the removal of organs, illicit international adoption, trafficking for early marriage, recruitment as child soldiers, for use in begging or as athletes, such as child camel jockeys or football trafficking. Child labor is a form of work that may be hazardous to the physical, mental, spiritual, moral, or social development of children and can interfere with their education. According to the International Labour Organization, the global number of children involved in child labor fell during the 12 years to 2012, it has declined by one-third, from 246 million in 2000 to 168 million children in 2012. Sub-Saharan Africa is the region with the highest incidence of child labor, while the largest numbers of child workers are found in Asia and the Pacific. IOM statistics indicate that a significant minority, 35%, of trafficked persons it assisted in 2011 were less than 18 years of age, which is roughly consistent with estimates from previous years. It was reported in 2010 that Thailand and Brazil were considered to have the worst child sex trafficking records. Traffickers in children may take advantage of the parents' extreme poverty. Parents may sell children to traffickers in order to pay off debts or gain income, or they may be deceived concerning the prospects of training and a better life for their children. They may sell their children into labor, sex trafficking, or illegal adoptions, although scholars have urged a nuanced understanding and approach to the issue, one that looks at broader socio-economic and political contexts. The adoption process, legal and illegal, when abused can sometimes result in cases of trafficking of babies and pregnant women around the world. In David M. Smolin's 2005 papers on child trafficking and adoption scandals between India and the United States, he presents the systemic vulnerabilities in the inter-country adoption system that makes adoption scandals predictable. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child at Article 34, states parties undertake to protect the child from all forms of sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. In the European Union, commercial sexual exploitation of children is subject to a Directive 2011/92/EU of the European Parliament and of the Council of December 13, 2011 on combating the sexual abuse and sexual exploitation of children and child pornography. The Hague Convention on Protection of Children and Cooperation in Respect of Inter-Country Adoption, or Hague Adoption Convention, is an international convention dealing with international adoption, that aims at preventing child laundering, child trafficking, and other abuses related to international adoption. The optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict seeks to prevent forceful recruitment, e.g. by guerrilla forces, of children for use in armed conflicts. Sex trafficking. The International Labour Organization claims that forced labor in the sex industry affects 4.5 million people worldwide. Most victims find themselves in coercive or abusive situations from which escape is both difficult and dangerous. Trafficking for sexual exploitation was formerly thought of as the organized movement of people, usually women, between countries and within countries for sex work with the use of physical coercion, deception and bondage through forced debt. However, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, U.S., does not require movement for the offense. The issue becomes contentious when the element of coercion is removed from the definition to incorporate facilitation of consensual involvement in prostitution. For example, in the United Kingdom, the Sexual Offences Act 2003 incorporated trafficking for sexual exploitation but did not require those committing the offence to use coercion, deception, or force, so that it also includes any person who enters the UK to carry out sex work with consent as having been trafficked. In addition, any minor involved in a commercial sex act in the US while under the age of 18 qualifies as a trafficking victim, even if no force, fraud, or coercion is involved, under the definition of severe forms of trafficking in persons in the U.S. Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Trafficked women and children are often promised work in the domestic or service industry, but instead are sometimes taken to brothels where they are required to undertake sex work, while their passports and other identification papers are confiscated. They may be beaten or locked up and promised their freedom only after earning, through prostitution, their purchase price, as well as their travel and visa costs. A forced marriage is a marriage where one or both participants are married without their freely given consent. Servile marriage is defined as a marriage involving a person being sold, transferred, or inherited into that marriage. According to ECPAT, child trafficking for forced marriage is simply another manifestation of trafficking and is not restricted to particular nationalities or countries. Forced marriages have been described as a form of human trafficking in certain situations and certain countries, such as China and its Southeast Asian neighbors, from which many women are moved to China, sometimes through promises of work, and forced to marry Chinese men. Ethnographic research with women from Myanmar and Cambodia found that many women eventually get used to their life in China and prefer it to the one they had in their home countries. Furthermore, legal scholars have noted that transnational marriage brokering was never intended to be considered trafficking by the drafters of the Palermo Protocol. Labor trafficking. Labor trafficking is the movement of persons for the purpose of forced labor and services. It may involve bonded labor, involuntary servitude, domestic servitude, and child labor. Labor trafficking happens most often within the domain of domestic work, agriculture, construction, manufacturing, and entertainment, and migrant workers and indigenous people are especially at risk of becoming victims. People smuggling is a related practice which is characterized by the consent of the person being smuggled. Smuggling situations can descend into human trafficking through coercion and exploitation. They are known to traffic people for the exploitation of their labor, for example, as transporters. Bonded labor, or debt bondage, is probably the least known form of labor trafficking today, and yet is the most widely used method of enslaving people. Victims become bonded when their labor, the labor which they themselves hired, and the tangible goods they have bought are demanded as a means of repayment for a loan or service whose terms and conditions have not been defined, or where the value of the victim's services is not applied toward the liquidation of the debt. Generally, the value of their work is greater than the original sum of money borrowed. Forced labor is a situation in which people are forced to work against their will under the threat of violence or some other form of punishment. Their freedom is restricted and a degree of ownership is exerted. Men and women are at risk of being trafficked for unskilled work, which globally generates $31 billion according to the International Labor Organization. Forms of forced labor can include domestic servitude, agricultural labor, sweatshop factory labor, janitorial, food service and other service industry labor, and begging. Some of the products that can be produced by forced labor are clothing, cocoa, bricks, coffee, cotton, and gold. Trafficking in organs is a form of human trafficking. It can take different forms. In some cases, the victim is compelled into giving up an organ. In other cases, the victim agrees to sell an organ in exchange of money/goods, but is not paid, or paid less. Finally, the victim may have the organ removed without the victim's knowledge, usually when the victim is treated for another medical problem/illness, real or orchestrated problem/illness. Migrant workers, homeless persons, and illiterate persons are particularly vulnerable to this form of exploitation. Trafficking of organs is an organized crime, involving several offenders: the recruiter, the transporter, the medical staff, the middlemen/contractors, the buyers. Trafficking for organ trade often seeks kidneys. Trafficking in organs is a lucrative trade because in many countries the waiting lists for patients who need transplants are very long. Some solutions have been proposed to help counter it. Fraud factory. Most fraud factories operate in Southeast Asia, including Cambodia, Myanmar, or Laos, and are typically run by a criminal gang. Fraud factory operators lure foreign nationals to scam hubs, where they are forced to scam internet users around the world into fraudulently buying cryptocurrencies or withdrawing cash, via social media and online dating apps. Trafficking victims' passports are confiscated, and they are threatened with organ theft, organ harvesting or forced prostitution if they do not scam sufficiently successfully. Causes. A complex set of factors fuel human trafficking, including poverty, unemployment, social norms that discriminate against women, institutional challenges, and globalization. Poverty and globalization. Poverty and lack of educational and economic opportunities in one's hometown may lead women to voluntarily migrate and then be involuntarily trafficked into sex work. As globalization opened up national borders to greater exchange of goods and capital, labor migration also increased. Less wealthy countries have fewer options for livable wages. The economic impact of globalization pushes people to make conscious decisions to migrate and be vulnerable to trafficking. Gender inequalities that hinder women from participating in the formal sector also push women into informal sectors. Long waiting lists for organs in the United States and Europe created a thriving international black market. Traffickers harvest organs, particularly kidneys, to sell for large profit and often without properly caring for or compensating the victims. Victims often come from poor, rural communities and see few other options than to sell organs illegally. Wealthy countries' inability to meet organ demand within their own borders perpetuates trafficking. By reforming their internal donation system, Iran achieved a surplus of legal donors and provides an instructive model for eliminating both organ trafficking and shortage. Globalization and the rise of internet technology has also facilitated human trafficking. Online classified sites and social networks such as Craigslist have been under intense scrutiny for being used by clients and traffickers in facilitating sex trafficking and sex work in general. Traffickers use explicit sites, e.g. Craigslist, Backpage, MySpace, to market, recruit, sell, and exploit women. Facebook, Twitter, and other social networking sites are suspected for similar uses. According to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, online classified ads reduce the risks of finding prospective customers. Studies have identified the Internet as the single biggest facilitator of commercial sex trade, although it is difficult to ascertain which women advertised are sex trafficking victims. Traffickers and pimps use the Internet to recruit minors, since Internet and social networking sites usage have significantly increased, especially among children. At the same time, critical scholars have questioned the extent of the role of Internet in human trafficking and have cautioned against sweeping generalizations and urged more research. While globalization fostered new technologies that may exacerbate human trafficking, technology can also be used to assist law enforcement and anti-trafficking efforts. A study was done on online classified ads surrounding the Super Bowl. A number of reports have noticed increase in sex trafficking during previous years of the Super Bowl. For the 2011 Super Bowl 45 held in Dallas, Texas, the Backpage for Dallas area experienced a 136% increase on the number of posts in the adult section on Super Bowl Sunday. In contrast, Sundays typically have the lowest number of posts. Researchers analyzed the most salient terms in these online ads, which suggested that many escorts were traveling across state lines to Dallas specifically for the Super Bowl, and found that the self-reported ages were higher than usual. Twitter was another social networking platform studied for detecting sex trafficking. Digital tools can be used to narrow the pool of sex trafficking cases, albeit imperfectly and with uncertainty. However, there has been no evidence found actually linking the Super Bowl, or any other sporting event, to increased trafficking or prostitution. Political and institutional. Corrupt and inadequately trained police officers can be complicit in human trafficking and or commit violence against sex workers, including trafficked victims. Human traffickers often incorporate abuse of the legal system into their control tactics by making threats of deportation or by turning victims into the authorities, possibly resulting in the incarceration of the victims. Anti-trafficking agendas from different groups can also be in conflict. In the movement for sex workers' rights, sex workers establish unions and organizations, which seek to eliminate trafficking. However, law enforcement also seek to eliminate trafficking and to prosecute trafficking, and their work may infringe on sex workers' rights and agency. For example, the Sex Workers Union DMSC, Durbar Mahila Samanwaya Committee, in Kolkata, India, has self-regulatory boards, SRBs, that patrol the red light districts and assist girls who are underage or trafficked. The union opposes police intervention and interferes with police efforts to bring minor girls out of brothels, on the grounds that police action might have an adverse impact on non-trafficked sex workers, especially because police officers in many places are corrupt and violent in their operations. A recent 7-country research by the Global Alliance Against Traffic in Women found that sex worker organizations around the world assist women in the industry who are trafficked and should be considered as allies in anti-trafficking work. Criminalization of sex work also may foster the underground market for sex work and enable sex trafficking. Difficult political situations such as civil war and social conflict are push factors for migration and trafficking. A study reported that larger countries, the richest and the poorest countries, and countries with restricted press freedom are likely to have higher levels of trafficking. Specifically, being in a transitional economy made a country 19 times more likely to be ranked in the highest trafficking category, and gender inequalities in a country's labor market also correlated with higher trafficking rates. The annual U.S. State Department Trafficking in Persons report for 2013 cited Russia and China as among the worst offenders in combating forced labor and sex trafficking, raising the possibility of U.S. sanctions being leveraged against these countries. In 1997 alone, as many as 175,000 young women from Russia, the former Soviet Union, and Eastern and Central Europe were sold as commodities in the sex markets of the developed countries in Europe and the Americas. Commercial demand for sex. Abolitionists who seek an end to sex trafficking explain the nature of sex trafficking as an economic supply and demand model. In this model, male demand for prostitutes leads to a market of sex work, which, in turn, fosters sex trafficking, the illegal trade and coercion of people into sex work, and pimps and traffickers become distributors who supply people to be sexually exploited. The demand for sex trafficking can also be facilitated by some pimps and traffickers' desire for women whom they can exploit as workers because they do not require wages, safe working circumstances, and agency in choosing customers. The link between demand for paid sex and incidences of human trafficking, as well as the demand for trafficking discourse more broadly, have never been proven empirically and have been seriously questioned by a number of scholars and organizations. To this day, the idea that trafficking is fueled by demand remains poorly conceptualized and based on assumptions rather than evidence. Vulnerable groups. The U.S. State Department's annual Trafficking in Persons report for 2016 stated that refugees and migrants, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex, LGBT, individuals, religious minorities, people with disabilities, and those who are stateless are the most at risk for human trafficking. Additionally, in its protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, the United Nations notes that women and children are particularly at risk for human trafficking and revictimization. The protocol requires state parties not only to enact measures that prevent human trafficking but also to address the factors that exacerbate women and children's vulnerability, including poverty, underdevelopment, and lack of equal opportunity. Consequences. Human trafficking victims face threats of violence from many sources, including customers, pimps, brothel owners, madams, traffickers, and corrupt local law enforcement officials, and even from family members who do not want to have any link with them. Because of their potentially complicated legal status and their potential language barriers, the arrest or fear of arrest creates stress and other emotional trauma for trafficking victims. The challenges facing victims often continue after their removal from coercive exploitation. In addition to coping with their past traumatic experiences, former trafficking victims often experience social alienation in the host and home countries. Stigmatization, social exclusion, and intolerance often make it difficult for former victims to integrate into their host community, or to reintegrate into their former community. Accordingly, one of the central aims of protection assistance is the promotion of reintegration. Too often, however, governments and large institutional donors offer little funding to support the provision of assistance and social services to former trafficking victims. As the victims are also pushed into drug trafficking, many of them face criminal sanctions also. Psychological. Short-term impact. The use of coercion by perpetrators and traffickers involves the use of extreme control. Perpetrators expose the victim to high amounts of psychological stress induced by threats, fear, and physical and emotional violence. Tactics of coercion are reportedly used in 3 phases of trafficking: recruitment, initiation, and indoctrination. During the initiation phase, traffickers use foot-in-the-door techniques of persuasion to lead their victims into various trafficking industries. This manipulation creates an environment where the victim becomes completely dependent upon the authority of the trafficker. Traffickers take advantage of family dysfunction, homelessness, and history of childhood abuse to psychologically manipulate women and children into the trafficking industry. One form of psychological coercion particularly common in cases of sex trafficking and forced prostitution is Stockholm Syndrome. Many women entering into the sex trafficking industry are minors who have already experienced prior sexual abuse. Traffickers take advantage of young girls by luring them into the business through force and coercion, but more often through false promises of love, security, and protection. This form of coercion works to recruit and initiate the victim into the life of a sex worker, while also reinforcing a trauma bond, also known as Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome is a psychological response where the victim becomes attached to his or her perpetrator. The goal of a trafficker is to turn a human being into a slave. To do this, perpetrators employ tactics that can lead to the psychological consequence of learned helplessness for the victims, where they sense that they no longer have any autonomy or control over their lives. Traffickers may hold their victims captive, expose them to large amounts of alcohol or use drugs, keep them in isolation, or withhold food or sleep. During this time the victim often begins to feel the onset of depression, guilt and self-blame, anger and rage, and sleep disturbances, PTSD, numbing, and extreme stress. Under these pressures, the victim can fall into the hopeless mental state of learned helplessness. For victims specifically trafficked for the purpose of forced prostitution and sexual slavery, initiation into the trade is almost always characterized by violence. Traffickers employ practices of sexual abuse, torture, brainwashing, repeated rape and physical assault until the victim submits to his or her fate as a sexual slave. Victims experience verbal threats, social isolation, and intimidation before they accept their role as a prostitute. For those enslaved in situations of forced labor, learned helplessness can also manifest itself through the trauma of living as a slave. Reports indicate that captivity for the person and financial gain of their owners adds additional psychological trauma. Victims are often cut off from all forms of social connection, as isolation allows the perpetrator to destroy the victim's sense of self and increase his or her dependence on the perpetrator. Long-term impact. Human trafficking victims may experience complex trauma as a result of repeated cases of intimate relationship trauma over long periods of time, including, but not limited to, sexual abuse, domestic violence, forced prostitution, or gang rape. Complex trauma involves multifaceted conditions of depression, anxiety, self-hatred, dissociation, substance abuse, self-destructive behaviors, medical and somatic concerns, despair, and revictimization. Psychology researchers report that, Although similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, complex trauma is more expansive in diagnosis because of the effects of prolonged trauma. Victims of sex trafficking often get branded by their traffickers or pimps. These tattoos usually consist of barcodes or the trafficker's name or rules. Even if a victim escapes their trafficker's control or gets rescued, these tattoos are painful reminders of their past and result in emotional distress. Removing or covering these tattoos can potentially cost survivors great sums of money. Psychological reviews have shown that the chronic stress experienced by many victims of human trafficking can compromise the immune system. Several studies found that chronic stressors, like trauma or loss, suppress cellular and humoral immunity. Victims may develop sexually transmitted infections and HIV/AIDS. Perpetrators frequently use substance abuse as a means to control their victims, which leads to compromised health, self-destructive behavior, and long-term physical harm. Furthermore, victims have reported treatment similar to torture, where their bodies are broken and beaten into submission. Children are especially vulnerable to these developmental and psychological consequences of trafficking due to their age. In order to gain complete control of the child, traffickers often destroy the physical and mental health of the children through persistent physical and emotional abuse. Victims experience severe trauma on a daily basis that devastates the healthy development of self-concept, self-worth, biological integrity, and cognitive functioning. Children who grow up in environments of constant exploitation frequently exhibit antisocial behavior, over-sexualized behavior, self-harm, aggression, distrust of adults, dissociative disorders, substance abuse, complex trauma, and attention deficit disorders. Stockholm Syndrome is also a common problem for trafficked girls, which can hinder them from both trying to escape and moving forward in psychological recovery programs. Although 98% of the sex trade is composed of women and girls, there is an effort to gather empirical evidence about the psychological impact of abuse common in sex trafficking upon young boys. Boys often will experience forms of post-traumatic stress disorder, but also additional stressors of social stigma of homosexuality associated with sexual abuse for boys, and externalization of blame, increased anger, and desire for revenge. HIV/AIDS. Sex trafficking increases the risk of contracting HIV/AIDS. The HIV/AIDS pandemic can be both a cause and a consequence of sex trafficking. On one hand, children are sought by customers because they are perceived as being less likely to be HIV positive, and this demand leads to child sex trafficking. On the other hand, trafficking leads to the proliferation of HIV, because victims often cannot protect themselves properly and get infected. Economic impacts. Organized criminal groups invest in a wide range of legitimate businesses to conceal and launder the profits earned from human trafficking. Fair competition may be undermined when human trafficking victims are exploited for cheap labor, driving down production costs, thereby indirectly causing a negative economic imbalance. This can also depress wages for legal laborers. According to the United Nations, human trafficking can be closely integrated into legal businesses, including the tourism industry, agriculture, hotel and airline operations, and leisure and entertainment businesses. Related crimes associated with human trafficking reportedly include fraud, extortion, racketeering, money laundering, bribery, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, car theft, migrant smuggling, kidnapping, document forgery, and gambling. Other economic costs that have been associated with human trafficking include lost labor productivity, human resources, taxable revenues, and migrant remittances, as well as unlawfully redistributed wealth and heightened law enforcement and public health costs. Thank you for watching this video.